This special presentation was produced in high definition by WEDU, Tampa, St. Petersburg, Sarasota.
Coming up next, Republicans say Charlie Crist needs to make public his wife's tax returns. The GOP is demanding that an ad attacking Governor Rick Scott be pulled from the airwaves. About 1/3 of the state legislature will be automatically elected this year without facing any opposition. And a whistleblower says the state is wrongly trying to force jobless people to repay their unemployment checks. Political Insights next on Florida This Week.
From the WEDU studios, this is Florida This Week. And now, moderator Rob Lorai.
Welcome back. This week our panelists are Paula Dockery is a former state senator, a columnist, and a Republican. Barry Edwards is a political strategist and a Democrat. Steve Bosquet is the Tallahassee bureau chief of the Tampa Bay Times. And Dan Ruth is an editorial board member and columnist with the Tampa Bay Times. Thank you so much for coming. It's great to see you. Well, tax returns became an issue in the governor's race this week when the leading Democrat in the race, Charlie Crist, released 10 years of federal income tax returns. Crist did not, however, release his wife Carol's returns, as some Republicans have called on him to do. Governor Scott and his wife Ann released their joint tax returns for 3 years, 2010, 2011, and 2012. A political committee working to re-elect Governor Scott put out an ad this week criticizing Crist for not releasing his wife's tax returns. The ad asks, what is Crist trying to hide?
Governor Rick Scott believes transparency matters. That's why he and his wife Ann released their tax returns in 2010 and again this year. But millionaire Charlie Crist refuses to release his spouse's tax returns. Candidates for governor routinely disclose those returns. Alex Sink and Rick Scott both did it 4 years ago. So what is Charlie Crist hiding? The people of Florida deserve to know. Charlie Crist, slick politician, lousy governor. Sponsored by Let's Get to Work.
Meantime, a pro-Crist group fought back with this ad.
Governor Rick Scott believes transparency matters.
Florida taxpayers could be on the hook for up to $2 billion.
This all centers around a lawsuit that accused the governor's administration of mishandling unemployment benefits for thousands of Floridians.
Diane Parcell says she was fired for raising questions about how the state treats people who receive unemployment compensation.
She was trying to expose cover-up, and her warnings were ignored by both the Department of Economic Opportunity and the governor's office.
His office was not helpful or receptive.
Diane Parcell says the climate in your administration, employees are not encouraged to do the right thing or penalized to do it.
This is just Charlie Crist, finding somebody to complain. The jury disagrees, concluding that Parcell was fired in retaliation for actions.
I don't have a vendetta. As I said, I'm a Republican.
So, Paula, let's start with the issue of Charlie Crist and his tax returns. Should he ask his wife Carol reveal their tax returns, her tax returns, rather?
I don't feel like the spouses of candidates ought to be expected to release their returns. They're not running for office, and I think that people have to be cognizant of the fact that even the candidates aren't required to give their tax returns. They are required to fill out a financial disclosure, and that's fine and proper. In fact, I think that voters need to know what businesses they're in, what companies they do business with, because you need to be able to look for conflicts of interest. So there's a difference between transparency and financial disclosures and handing over tax returns. When you fill out a tax return, that's your private business between you and the IRS. And I don't even know if Charlie Crist has the authority or the right to ask his wife to turn over her returns, because that's up to her.
Steve, there is mounting pressure, though, on Charlie Crist to ask his wife Carol to do this.
Right. I respectfully disagree. I think she should release the returns. In fact, because Charlie Crist, who's usually a more adept at this than he has been, he's allowing Rick Scott to drive the narrative in this governor's campaign, and that's dangerous. And also, I'm the guy that's written these stories about Rick Scott's secretive travel schedule and so forth. I mean, he's allowed Rick Scott to get the upper hand in the transparency argument, which is shocking in a way. Charlie Crist ran an open shop as governor, and he created the Office of Open Government. And my view of it is this. Oh, yes, Carol Crist is a private citizen, But if you're going to enjoy the trappings of being a first lady, if you're going to live in the mansion and ride around with FDLE protection, then it's not asking too much to ask her to open her finances.
And Steve, is it true that a husband can transfer part of his holdings to his wife? I mean, in a marital relationship, as Scott did,
yes,
right? So that's why I think the Republicans are dogging this too, right?
It's true. One thing that you made a good point. You're not obligated to release your tax returns. Elected officials can release their tax return in addition to the financial disclosure form. Some do, most don't. And there is information in there that some folks would rather not have out there for the general public. But Charlie Crist has always made his tax returns public.
And I would also have to respectfully disagree with Senator Dockery. Here's the thing. Yes, when you become the First Lady of Florida, you become a quasi-public official. You have public duties. You are living in the governor's mansion. You are receiving FDLE protection. And you are playing a role in that government. And by hiding your spouse's income or assets, that does open up, we're cynical people, and it does open up the possibility that someone might aggrandize a first lady with financial benefits that accrue to her husband, and they do it indirectly, and so we have to know these things. And I think if he gets elected, he will be compelled to release his wife's money. And here's the other thing that's so absurd about this. No matter what they're worth, and they're probably worth a fair chunk of change, they are still paupers compared to Scott and his wife. So if they're worried about this perception of the rich guy running for office, he's well-to-do, he's comfortable, he's done very well. They are nowhere near Rick Scott's.
Scott is still 100 times more.
He's worth about $300 million.
Yeah, 100 times more. He has 100 times more assets. Barry, what's your take on this?
I hate to gang on, or pile on. I respectfully disagree too. Public service is a choice. Rick Scott, Charlie Crist, whoever runs for office, especially for governor, they choose to do this. And I think upon reflection over the weekend, Governor Crist will make the right decision and talk to his wife and get the released, because he's always been about restoring confidence and transparency in government, and this is an aberration. And whether I trust him, it's the Republican down the street that needs to trust him too, and the independent down my street that needs to trust him, so they trust their Florida government. And I think one of the reasons why people don't trust their Florida government and want the spouses released is here in Hillsborough County, a few years ago, Jim Norman had a friend, and his friend gave a $500,000 house to his wife, and he said he didn't know anything about it. But it was at the closing. He signed the closing documents, and
maybe at the end of the day, Carol's a little embarrassed that she's made a family fortune on hand buzzers.
Paula, come back at these guys.
Yeah, well, first of all, any instance that you show, any example you show, like the Norman example, the truth was outed and the punishment was given. But the fact is that we're talking about a tax return. If you want the information, ask for the information. You want to know who she does business with? Ask who she does business with. But why should anybody? I mean, we as Americans are giving up a lot of our freedoms and a lot of our privacy.
It's part of the political narrative that candidates running for office at high levels, whether it's the presidency or the United States Senate or a governorship, we have set this precedent of people in that position releasing their tax returns. And so you may think it's unfair, and maybe in some existential sense it is, but the reality is, in our political environment today, the release of the tax returns has become standard operating procedure among the high-profile political candidates.
Should it be the adult children as well? Should it be the parents? Should it be the siblings?
I'll draw a line there for you if it'll make you happy.
Let me ask the flip side of this. Well, let me ask the flip side of this.
The sooner he does it, the sooner the issue dies. The day he does it, there won't be any articles from our colleagues.
All right, let me ask the flip side of this, and that is Governor Scott in his ad says that he believes in transparency. Based on what we... Dan, what's your take on that?
He's the apparition of the Appalachian Parkway, for crying out loud. I mean, he's probably the least transparent chief executive that this state's ever had. And for him to make that claim, he may make other claims, but he is, and Steve knows this far better than he's better qualified. But this is an extremely non-transparent governor who's governed in the shadows for the past 4 years and won't even make his schedule a public record. You have to pull it out of his staff's
Steve, you have a hard time getting the information about what the governor's doing?
It goes back to the essence of Rick Scott, the candidate. He's a private sector guy, a CEO guy. I haven't been able to get information like, believe it or not, information that might accrue to Rick Scott's benefit. I've asked this question for 3.5 years. He sold the state planes. His wife is the technical owner of the plane he flies around in. Okay, it's a Cessna Citation worth well over $1 million. How much has that saved the taxpayers by him riding around in his own plane? He pays for the operation and maintenance of that plane. They won't tell us. You know, we can't find out who's flying around with the governor. We can't find out who's on these passenger manifests. I attribute it to this. Charlie Crist came out of a legislative background. And even though the legislature technically is not subject to the Sunshine Law, we know that, but there's a level of openness and accessibility that people in public life accept as part of the bargain of being in public office that's been a big adjustment for Rick Scott.
Okay. Well, Florida Republicans are urging television stations not to air a new ad from Democrats highlighting the legal problems of Scott's former companies. The party says the ad contains false, misleading, and defamatory information about the current governor. The ad is paid for by the Florida Democratic Party and covers Scott's work as chair of the Hospital Corporation of America. Under his tenure there, the company was hit with the biggest health care fraud fine of all time. The ad also highlights video from Scott from a deposition in which he pled the Fifth Amendment 75 separate times.
Maybe you've heard about what was the largest Medicare fraud in history committed when Rick Scott was a CEO. Or that Scott's company paid record fraud fines of $1.7 billion. And when Scott was deposed in lawsuits about his company, he took the fifth 75 times. Meaning 75 times Scott refused to answer questions, because if he had, he might admit to committing a crime. A troubling past. And now Rick Scott is our governor. Sponsored by the Florida Democratic Party.
The Republican Party, though, says the ad is false because Scott was not testifying about the Medicare fraud, but about another matter. Newspapers have looked into the question, and both the Tampa Tribune and the Tampa Bay Times say the ad is accurate mostly. So, Dan, the Republicans say it's a different issue that Scott was testifying on, and that ad is misleading. Is that ad fair or not?
I think it's very fair. Nice to see him with some hair, too. Yeah, I mean, the idea, what they're saying is, that sleazy thing he did over here, that wasn't what that deposition was about. It was this other sleazy thing that was going on that he took the fifth in. I mean, this is a classic case where they should just shut up and move on, because he did take the fifth 75 times, whether it was directly related to the hospital issue or some other matter going on at HCA at the time. You know, when you take the fifth, you have every constitutional right to take the Fifth Amendment against, but then don't turn around and run for governor and expect that people aren't going to bring this up. It was brought up 4 years ago, and they're bringing it up again, and they're trying to be, I suspect, a little more deft about it. But, I mean, that's fair game. And I sometimes think, too, maybe my colleagues will disagree, that the average viewer of these things, once you see it about 150 times, you begin to become a little inured to it as well. And so while it certainly has some impact and has some value over the long haul of a campaign, I don't think it makes much difference one way or the other. The public was well aware that he took the fifth 4 years ago, and it didn't seem to make much difference.
Barry, what's your take? Will the TV ads continue to run? Will the TV stations reject these ads, or is this?
They should run them, and I think that he has the best press secretary in the world in George Orwell when he says these are false and he's transparent. Only George Orwell could make those words mean that, and. They are false, but I think that we ought to look at, his accusations against them are false. They're basically true. They should run, and he's a whiner. But we ought to look at, I even take his word that on some of the things he didn't know what was going on in his company. Well, he ran as a competent manager. And I question his management if he didn't know all these things were happening under his company, and now we have the Economic Office of Opportunity with the unemployment claims. He didn't know what was going on there. If he's running as a great CEO, shouldn't he know what's going on? If not, let's fire him.
Steve?
I think the interesting part here, the larger point, is that, as you point out, this was an attack line that was used. He got it from both sides in 2010. He got it from Bill McCollum in the primary on this issue big time. He beat McCollum. He gets it from Alex Sink, and he beats Alex Sink. The public knew about it in 2010. What this approach tells me is that the Democrats, again, this is an interesting thing about this governor, unique in the history of Florida politics, is that they're playing on an idea that most voters really don't know that much about this guy. And also, as I pointed out in stories, you have the electorate in the state changes so much every 4 years. You have a lot of new voters who are going to be asked to vote for Rick Scott for the first time this time.
So even though it didn't work for Sink 4 years ago or McCollum 4 years ago, you think is it going to work this time around?
I don't know the answer to that. I think they think that with Charlie Crist as the likely nominee, they have a better messenger for the same message. So.
Yeah. Paul, what do you think?
Well, I think that after Rick Scott campaign spent $15 million bashing everything you possibly can, although I'm sure they'll come up with more, on Charlie Crist, that to then turn around after the very first salvo and say, stop, you're being mean to me,
you're hurting me,
looks a little weak. I think he'd have been better off just kind of letting it go, and there's not going to be that much money for it to be running.
Because that creates a whole new cycle of stories.
It reminds me of the story in Casablanca. I'm shocked, there's gambling going on here. Oh, here's your winning.
And this nonsense about asking TV stations to take the ads off the air, first of all, I think, and I worked in television for a long time, as you have, the television station manager doesn't want to be the referee in deciding. I mean, there's a kernel of truth, and there's probably a half-truth in every TV ad that's ever been made.
But there's no precedent for taking an ad off the air, is there?
No, I don't think so. And the TV station in West Palm Beach that takes Charlie Crist's ad off the air Monday is going to be asked to take Rick Scott's ad off the air Tuesday. And where do you draw that line?
Right. Okay. Well, 1/3 of the people running for the state legislature this fall will face no opponent. The lack of an opponent means candidates for 8 state Senate seats, all incumbent Republicans, and 38 House seats, all but one an incumbent, have already automatically won their seats, even though the election is not until November. That makes this year's legislative elections even less competitive than 2012. Critics say part of the problem is redistricting. That is, legislative seats are still being drawn with a specific political party in mind. But in defense, one candidate told the Tampa Bay Times that it's a sign that these candidates are doing a good job. Among those who are being elected without an opponent, Senator Wilton Simpson, Senator Bill Galvano, and Senator Nancy Dieter, and Representatives Dennis Baxley, Clovis Watson, Charlie Stone, Jimmy Smith, Richard Corcoran, Kerry Pigman, Ben Albritton, Jake Rayburn, Dana Young, Janet Cruz, Jim Boyd, Greg Stubbe, Matt Hudson, Evan Jenny, and Kathleen Pasadomo. So, Steve, I can hear the legislators saying right now, we had a fair redistricting process. It's not redistricting. But what's your take? Does redistricting have anything to do with this?
Some, but I'm interested to hear your point of view on this. And covering that place for 30 years, there's several things going on at work here. And I may be the only person on the panel that will say this, but I will say this on your program. Some legislators do a good job, okay? I mean, someone like a Nancy Dieter, who I've covered for 20 years, is a conscientious, hardworking legislator. And if you live in Sarasota or Charlotte County, you've got to have your head examined to try to run against her and lose to her. She's an incumbent who's going to raise a lot of money very easily and could easily get reelected. Then you've got the fact that term limits is a big factor here, because what people do is they look at the clock on the wall and think, that guy's only there 6 more years, then it's an open seat, I'll run when the seat's open. Mm-hmm. Incumbents in Tallahassee can raise stunning, staggering amounts of money. That's probably the biggest problem at work here.
Paula, what's your take on this?
Steve's exactly right. It's a little bit of redistricting, it's incumbency, it's money, and it's term limits. And a lot of people, and Nancy is a great legislator, but she has 2 years left or 4 years left, a term left. So a lot of people will say, well, I want to run for that seat, but I'll wait till she's done because I can't raise the money. I'm not going to beat her. So the legislators who tend to get opponents are the ones that have a perceived weakness. If they had a tough vote, or if they had some ethical lapse or whatever, then you're going to see that might be one. So then you're going to see some opponents. But a lot of this is just that with term limits, people are going to wait their turn, wait till it's an open seat.
Millions of people are not going to get a chance to vote for a state senator or a state representative.
It's the best little whorehouse in Tallahassee. It's that simple. The books are cooked. For all the reasons you pointed out, the way the districts are drawn, it makes it almost impossible to upset an incumbent that's deeply entrenched.
Because the incumbents get the lion's share of the campaign contributions. They get the lion's share of the money,
and they get the lion's share of the lobbyist support. And let's face it, this isn't a legislature. Look, can we just abuse ourselves of this notion that this is a legislature? It's not. It's a lobbyist masterclass. And you go up to Tallahassee, and Paul is an exception to the rule, but most people go up to Tallahassee and they spend their time up there until their term limited out, learning how to become a lobbyist, where the big money is. And so they're very protective of those seats. And it is hardly a democratic. It does not say much about our democracy.
Barry, what's your take on that? What of all the reasons you've heard here?
I think the redistricting is a large part of it. It was well-intentioned when they did the fair districts, and it was hijacked. And it was hijacked throughout the entire. Paul and I dealt a lot with that, Senator Dockery, during the last redistricting. there's only 10 House seats in the entire state that are competitive right now. There may be 1 or 2 in the state Senate this year that could be competitive. So the elections are all concentrated in those things. And once you get in as an incumbent, your party protects you. And the Republican Party has $16 million, and the Democratic Party has $2-3 million, whatever it is. So you only have to win once, and then you're there.
And that's how we wind up with that gathering of eagles that you just listed a few minutes ago.
There's one competitive Senate election in Florida this cycle, and it's in Broward and Palm Beach counties, where it's a rematch between Maria Sachs, the Democrat who's in office, and Ellen Bogdanoff, the Republican. And Ellen Bogdanoff, is a strong candidate who served in the Senate and the House. And because the Republicans only have one place where they have to fight a battle, they're going to have a ton of money to spend in that race. And you know what? No coincidence. The voter registration in that district is fairly close, fairly competitive. They'll vote a Democrat in one cycle and a Republican in the next.
Okay. Well, a former employee of the Florida Department of Economic Opportunity went public this week saying she was fired in 2012 after reporting problems in the way the state agency handled unemployment claims. The employee, Diane Parcell, says her agency was improperly sending collection agencies to people that the DEO suspected of wrongly being given unemployment benefits. The collection agencies tried to collect the unemployment money after it already had been paid out. Parcell found nearly 100 cases in which the state could not legally collect the money. She became aware of the matter after one person demanded $100,000 from the state for being told that he had wrongly been paid unemployment. That man challenged the state and won. Now, she says the DEO broke the law when it fired her. She also said that the governor's office did nothing to fix the problem. By her estimates, some 19,000 Floridians have wrongly been asked to repay their unemployment checks. If they all fight the state and they all win, she estimates that the taxpayers could be on the hook for $1.9 billion. The governor's office, though, described the whistleblower's public statement as an election year stunt. So, Barry, if this catches on and there are 19,000 people who've wrongly been asked to repay their unemployment compensation, that's a big deal. But she could be wrong, too, right?
Well, the first court that held it said she was right. And I think she is right. And the $1.9 billion as a Florida taxpayer means a lot to me, but I spoke to several legislators today talking about this. And only one, I think, got it in the right perspective. That was Darrell Rasan from St. Petersburg. What about those 19,000 people that had, not only were they sent to collection agencies, so they're getting harassed, but their credit bureau reports too. So when they go to buy a car, and these are obviously people that are unemployed, go to buy a car, they're not going to be able to get it. They're going to have to pay a higher rate of interest or not get it at all. And this goes back to the culture of incompetent management by our current governor. If he's a great manager, which is what he claims, why does he not know about this? And why did he resist when he found out about it and not fix the problem?
Paul?
This is a big deal, and it points to an agency that has had trouble before with the computer program. And when people complained to all the various legislative offices and said we can't get on the computer system, it was downplayed. It was, oh no, there's no problem, there's no problem. There was a problem and it wasn't fixed, and now you have this going on. So DEO is an agency that has some
Republicans
problems.
were outraged over the failure of the website for the Affordable Care Act.
Obamacare, yeah.
Where is their outrage here? I see such hypocrisy about that this went on for months and months and months and months, and I don't even know if it's still fixed.
Okay. Well, before we go, what other news story should we be paying attention to? Barry, your other big news story.
I think the big news story of this week is that Attorney General Bondi has decided to join in and challenge the marriage equality. And I think that history is not on her side. And as Attorney General, the Chief Legal Officer for the state, her job is to look at the constitutionality. Voters like me, we make mistakes and vote for things that are unconstitutional all the time. And she's going to choose to either be remembered like Leroy Collins or George Wallace. Her choice.
And it's written, though, into the Constitution, you know, that marriage is between a man and a woman.
That's in the Florida Constitution,
right.
But the U.S. Constitution, I think everywhere in the country, every federal judge is declaring those laws unconstitutional. I think that as a smart attorney, she could probably see that the writing's on the wall and history is not on her side.
All right, Dan, your other big story.
My boss, Tim Nickens, always tells people when they come in to meet with the editorial board that everything they say can and will be used against them, either in a news story or an editorial, because we always have reporters in the room. We call it our Times version of the Miranda rule. City Council Chairman and Heartline Chairman Mike Suarez didn't take that to heed this week when he was meeting with the board and blithely said, oh, there's no way we can get a transit referendum on a Hillsborough ballot by until 2018. Mayor Buckhorn was not happy about that.
So you got a call from the mayor?
Mike Merrill was not happy about it. And a whole host of other people who are actively involved in trying to, and we are going to get that on the 2016 ballot. But Mike Suarez did not bathe himself in glory this week.
All right, Steve, your other big story.
I want to harken back to a column I wrote this week where I raised the question of why won't Rick Scott take a stand on Amendment 1? Medical marijuana is Amendment 2, but Amendment 1 is the Land and Water Amendment, which would set aside dock stamp money for 20 years to do all kinds of things, to buy preservation land, to clean up the rivers and lakes in the state. People in the state care about the land and water and the future of the state. 3 times over 2 weeks we tried to get Rick Scott to take a stand, and he took a pass every time. And I don't think it's asking too much to ask the governor and the elected leader of 19 million Floridians to say where he stands on a proposed amendment to the Florida Constitution. I mean, he's personally against medical marijuana, that's fine. But the land and water thing is a big deal, and there is a public policy argument against it that involves the budgeting authority.
And there are Republicans heavily involved in that, including Allison DeFore, right?
Allison DeFore, Bill McCullum supports it, Tom Slade supports it. How about Nat Reed, who ran the Department of the Interior under Richard Nixon, who still lives in Hope Sound? He's for it. Right. You know, take a stand.
Okay. Paula, your other big story.
Some good news. There was a bill that was signed by the governor, passed by, sponsored by Jack Latvala in the Senate and Dan Rollerson in the House, that gave much-needed independence to the inspector generals. This is something that came out of the grand jury, statewide grand jury report recommendations back in 2010. Because Florida ranks so high in public corruption. And this is good news that those inspector generals that are housed in every single state agency now will have some independence from the agency head and report to the chief inspector general. Still not completely independent, but that's what we need, is somebody who will go into those agencies, look for the problems, answer constituents' complaints about things that are going on there. And so that was good news. So kudos to the governor and kudos to the legislature, including Representative Dan Rollerson and Senator Jack Latvala.
Very good. Well, thank you all for a great show, and thank you for watching Florida This Week. We want to hear from you. You can write us at ftw@wedu.org, and please follow us on Facebook and Twitter. You can watch this program online on the wedu.org website beginning Monday morning. We'll see you next Friday night at 8:30 and Sunday afternoon at 12:30. And from all of us here at WEDU, have a great weekend.
Florida This Week is a production of WEDU, who is solely responsible for its content.